Start. Hello, so this is the Modern Anglo podcast, first episode, you could say. I mean, I've never done this before, so it could be an absolute flunk. I'm here today with Fraser Hill. He's from the National Distributist Party. So we're going to be talking a lot about his party, his background, his story, and like what got him into politics. And so let's get started then. So Fraser, could you tell us a bit more about the National Distributist Party and just your background then?
Yeah, I'd be more than happy to. I'll start with my background, since probably best to get me out the way and then talk about the party. I'm Fraser, I'm 22 now. I am the leader of the National Distributist Party, and I've been the leader since November of last year. I got into the party in about 2022, so they were only about a year old when I joined. And the thing that really made me political was the COVID pandemic, of course. I think it's what made a lot of people political. The amount of incompetency and corruption on display just made me feel quite sick. And I experienced a lot of personal attacks for my stances around about that time. That was the first and second year of university. And that just made me want to get into politics to prove those kinds of people wrong and stand up for what I thought was the truth, what I still think is the truth, and what I believe in. I joined the NDP because of all the parties that I saw popping up around 2022 and 2023. I thought the NDP was principled. I think it presented a nice list of policies. The platform on which it stood, I thought, was sensible. It was nationalistic and it was Christian, but it remained sensible. It didn't get LARPy in any way. And just personally, it drew, and still, of course, draws on the teachings and the wisdom of a couple of people I would consider personal heroes, or at least consider very wise people, and certainly worth considering the teachings and wisdom of. People like G.K. Chesterton and two of the popes as well, Pope Leo the 13th and Pope Pius the 12th. You know, these are very intelligent people, were very intelligent people, and what they said and what they've transmitted down to us today, well, it certainly bears thinking about and bears discussion. And so I joined the party because I thought I really want to know more about this kind of thinking. What is distributism? Where does Christianity or even Catholicism fit in our modern society? I wanted to know more about it. I signed up, and a couple of years down the line, I stepped into the role of party leader. And I'm proud to step into the role of party leader, even if I feel a bit under-equipped.
Yeah, sounds good. It sounds really interesting because obviously when I first met you and got to understand the party and that, there was a lot of sort of you could say like it was just all very new to me, like this sort of relationship between like nationalism, distributism, and Christianity as well. I guess that's probably you probably see it as some sort of like trinity in a way for your party. Could you explain like the relationship between the three?
Nationalism, distributism, and Christianity?
Yeah.
I have this discussion a lot with people, and there does seem to be quite a prominent group of distributists who are either not Christian or not nationalistic, and I find that quite interesting, and I'm always curious how they arrive at those beliefs, because they're very, very strongly distributist, but they're not very strongly Christian or strongly nationalist. But the way I see them all being connected is in the sense that nationalism describes a political standing. It describes a love of your people and a belief that states and peoples should be organized along ethnic, perhaps even racial lines, and that is the best way to organize those people. Christianity provides social underpinnings to the states that would exist as a result of nationalism. It informs morality, it informs how you should order hierarchy and patronage. And distributism is how you should economically organize those resulting states. I don't think you can be distributist without being Christian and being nationalist. I think that distributist ideology is downstream of those other two things. And I think it is strange that there are people who arrive at distributism having not gone through the paths of nationalism or Christianity. The three of them all join together to provide a well-rounded political, and economic, and social outlook that I think would be the best for Britain at the very least.
But yeah, so distributism then, I don't think a lot of people really know about that sort of economic ideology. I mean, obviously we know about like socialism and sort of like conservatism and stuff like, yeah, capitalism and stuff like that. But distributism was very new to me when I first obviously got to know your party a bit. I understand that it's more like focusing on like local businesses and like families and sort of like going against like monopolization. But yeah, you can tell me a bit more in detail what it's really about.
Yeah, I get this a lot. People don't understand what distributism is. They don't know what it is at the outset. And so subscribing to the party can seem a bit impenetrable without knowing what distributism is. To put it concisely, distributism is localism that has a distinct emphasis on property and ownership. When I first got into distributism, it was described to me as this. If capitalism is about ownership by capitalists, private enterprising individuals, and socialism is about ownership by the state, by the government and the civil servants that comprise it, distributism is about ownership by as many small individuals as possible. My camera's done it again. I'm just going to turn the camera off. We'll just continue as is.
Yeah, no problem.
Yes, distributism is about ownership of, well, capitalists own wealth, they own land, and the state takes up land, the means of production. We'll talk about it in the sense of means of production. That's the most accessible way, I think, for people. Distributism is about ownership of the means of production by as many people as possible at once. And so that is exhibited by small businesses, by personal house ownership and personal land ownership. So small farms, or even just farming for your own sake. So personal gardens, household gardens. And it has an emphasis, yes, as you said, on avoiding monopolization, on avoiding accumulation by the state. It wants to provide everyone with 3 acres and a cow. That's how Chesterton put it. Everyone should have the ability to own for themselves their place of living, how they make their livelihood, those sorts of things. And so it differs from socialism in that we don't want a large government to look after us, essentially. And it differs from capitalism because it doesn't want a lot of workers to be employed by a small class of aristocrats. It wants those workers to, if they wish, be able to work for themselves or to work for a much larger number of smaller capitalists, people who run family businesses or who run a single supermarket or single factory in one place, rather than working for middle managers for a much larger millionaire or billionaire who owns dozens of factories, dozens of supermarkets all across the country.
Yeah, so it kind of reminds me a bit of like sort of like countryside vibes. So like keeping everything like in the sort of like local community, being kind of a sort of like I would say it's probably like in between like socialism and capitalism in a way. But you mentioned obviously about like Chesterton, and I know when we were first like talking about the party and that, I actually thought that you were referring to Arthur Chesterton, who was the founder. I believe he was a member
League
of
of
the
Imperial Loyalists.
Yeah, he was a member of British Union of Fascists, but then he obviously created the what was it called, the members of the British Empire.
It's the League of Imperial Loyalists.
Yeah, that's it.
A.K. Chesterton was his cousin.
Yeah, cousin. Yeah.
It's
So could you talk a bit more about was it R.K. Chesterton's background?
Yeah, Arthur
A.K.
something Chesterton. I don't know much about him, admittedly. I don't know much about him apart from his familial relation to Gilbert Keith Chesterton. I do know something quite interesting about distributism. So, G.K. Chesterton was most famously a fiction writer, writing the character of Father Brown. I think that's what we know him best for today. He wrote a lot of political and theological philosophy. He wrote some politics and also dabbled in poetry. So he was quite a wide-ranging individual. And briefly, he was a political figure because he did form a distributist political party in the 1920s and 30s called the Distributist League, which carried on until his death in 1936, I believe. But what is interesting, actually, about distributism is that people nowadays use the term third position to describe fascism as the third position apart from communism and Western democracy. But distributism was the original definition of third positionism because it was an economic third position. It was apart from capitalism and socialism. And because distributism never actually took off, the party fell apart in 1936 after Chesterton passed away. People don't think of third positionism as distributism. They think of it as fascism. And that is something that I want to pull away from, because whenever I describe myself as a third positionist, people say, what, so you're a fascist? And that's not true. But yes, it is interesting to see the similarities between distributism and fascism, third positionism, or at least the links, not the similarities, the links. And you mentioned A.K. Chesterton, who I believe was across in the family and down a generation. I think they were once removed. He was younger than Gilbert Keith Chesterton. When G.K. Chesterton died in 1936, his political party, the Distributist League, floundered without his leadership and ultimately fell apart. But the vast majority of distributism's members actually ended up going to the Mosleyite BUF and then eventually on to A.K. Chesterton's League of Imperial Loyalists. It does beg the question of, is there so little economic representation, or I suppose just representation of the distributist economic stance, that distributists felt very unrepresented in the 1930s, and that the only place they could go to essentially was the Union of Fascists. I find it quite a fascinating link, actually. This is probably me rambling a bit about my own personal interests, but I do want to find more to read about this, why all of the distributists in the 1930s ended up jumping to fascism, because it is an ideology that advances democracy. We are localists, we're subsidiarists. That means that we want things to be conducted on as local level as possible, and that includes empowering local officials to do more for their communities than they do currently, and that involves democracy, I think. But yeah, A.K. Chesterton led a lot of the distributists away through the BUF and ultimately to the League of Imperial Loyalists. And I think it does lend some credence to distributism as a genuinely nationalistic ideology. The fact that many people who believed in distributism came almost immediately to believing in the BUF and later on the League of Imperial Loyalists is almost an indictment of the Conservatives, the Labour, the establishment politicians at the time in the 1930s. They were so divorced from caring for their own people that true nationalists, like the distributists, would rather go into bed with fascists than with the Tories or with Labour. Or I think back then it was still the Conservatives and the Labour back then. No, wait a minute. Labour, yeah, it was Labour back then as well. Yeah. But yeah, it's interesting. But A.K. Chesterton, I don't know much about personally. All I know is that he would eventually lead some of the Distributists away to the League of Empire Loyalists. That must be in the 1950s, I think. I think that was in 1955.
Yeah, it's definitely like really interesting. I didn't actually know that many of like the Distributist members of the party, the Distributist League, that A.K. Chesterton set it up. Yeah, I didn't realize that they really like got funneled away into fascism. I mean, if people don't know, obviously the League of Empire Loyalists is sort of like the sort of like father of what we kind of recognize now as like it eventually became like the National Front and then the British National Party. So it is definitely like a sort of, I don't know, really. It's really interesting because you wouldn't really associate fascism with distributism. But in that regard, would you say that there is any sort of like links that you were talking about? You were talking about like fascism and distributism having some sort of relationship. Do you reckon you could go into that a bit more?
Yeah, sure. So I think, as I was saying, what really took a lot of the distributists away from conventional politics and over to the BUF is basically that distributism is a protest vote. It's a protest ideology against the system that we've had for the last 120 years. This is a system that supports large business or it supports massive government. And those are two things that distributism really wants to avoid at its fundamental core. And so any ideology that claims to be wanting to attack that establishment, as distributism did, and as ultimately the BUF did, and later League of Empire Loyalists, the National Front, the BNP, all these things. I think that is what really drew a lot of the distributists straight over, the fact that these were avowedly nationalistic ideologies, or at least ideological rhetorics. There may have been insincerity there. I don't know much about the National Front, and very little about the BNP, to be fair. But what I can tell you is that distributists are sincere in their nationalism. When I describe distributism to people, I emphasize that it's Christian, and true Christians should be nationalistic. I also emphasize that being a localist ideology and a localist party, a party that puts the emphasis on the smallest groups of people, basically on the individual level as much as it can, it is in inherent disagreement with globalism and with liberalism. It wants to champion the small person. I suppose individualism claims to want to champion the small person, liberalistic and modernist individualism, but it's very shallow. It's an individualism that's steeped in hedonism. It's steeped in self-aggrandizement, and ironically, the people who are most about their individualism are the ones who most want to open the doors to the entire world. And so it's just a very, very strange way to think. But distributism was essentially a protest from all of that. It wanted to bring things back to tradition. It wanted to bring things back to the nation and to its people. And I think there was a glimmer of hope that fascistic movements in the 1930s and 40s and 50s would do that. And of course, that was squandered. And it was a lie. But distributism, yes. I think distributists, they don't want fascism. We want to maintain democracy. But it's a matter of who is going to actually offer that opportunity to us. Now we have distributist representation once again in a plurality of small political parties. not in the least the National Distributist Party. We bear the name. And the hope is that we can achieve a democratic distributist state rather than having to rely on shortcuts like a fascist jump to power or a Thatcherite jump to power. We want to win on our own principles. Maybe that'll be possible, maybe it won't be. It's unfortunate to have to be realistic, but yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. The fact that it was obviously a protest vote, and obviously the passing of Chesterton meant that there wasn't really a figure to fill that void in a way. So in terms of obviously we've explored the relationship between nationalism and distributism in a way. Could we talk more about your sort of thoughts on the relationship between nationalism and Christianity, specifically, because there's sort of this notion a lot in the space that Christian nationalism is a contradiction. I mean, we see it a lot in America, because obviously America was kind of built on the sort of I guess the Pilgrim Fathers, for example. A lot of Christian refuge was over in America in the early days. That's why their sort of nationalism is more Christianity based. But in terms of obviously the European, the British sort of way of thinking, could you explain a bit more about the sort of relationship between those two?
Yeah, of course. I'm not going to bore people listening, and I won't bore you with delving into biblical explanations of it, really getting into the nitty-gritty of it. But if you look at even the most well-known biblical stories, for example, the story of Babel, you see that there was a deliberate intent to split the peoples of the world up and send them to their respective corners. If you're a believing Christian, a Christian fundamentalist perhaps, who believes in the word of the Bible, then you should say and see that a story like the Tower of Babel, in which God does split up the peoples of the world, indicates that we should not all live in interchangeable economic units. There should be something that defines us and divides us. If you look at it on a practical level, people shouldn't have to and don't function well living in proximity to people that they disagree with. Democracy certainly does not function well living or trying to accommodate people living together who disagree very greatly. Because, this is how I at least personally describe it, democracy is a spectrum, and the spectrum functions best when the two ends of it can clearly see one another and understand one another's positions. But modern liberalism and globalism have taken a hand on both ends of this spectrum and stretched it. And they've stretched it so egregiously now that the far left and the far right, or the globalist end and the nationalist end of the spectrums, can no longer see one another, can no longer relate in any meaningful way, and as a result, can not compromise. And when you can't compromise in a democracy, you leave no choice but to resort to violence or underhanded tactics, a subversion of the system in order to achieve what you believe should be achieved. And obviously, yes, that wrenching of the system, the wrenching of the spectrum apart, comes through an end to shared faith, an end to shared culture, an end to shared nationality. The importation of so many different faiths and cultures and peoples has made common ground impossible to find. And so that's why I think that nationalism fundamentally is a big part of distributism, and why we need to focus on bringing the spectrum back towards a shorter reality, essentially. And yeah, I think Christianity and nationalism are fundamentally linked, because the Bible and Christians, they call on you to attack sin and to attack immorality They do not call on you to tolerate what is intolerable. And they desire for people to live among their neighbors. And that does not mean that you should live among anyone of the human race, anyone from any part of the planet. It means that you should live amongst those who share your beliefs and who share your traditions and who share your culture. There is a big synergy, I think, between the Christian view of the world and the Christian view of nationalism, as I describe it at least, and what actually is seen to work. If as a Christian nationalist, I tell you that people should be organized into states that are largely religiously and ethnically homogenous, and you say, oh, that's not very Christian, we should all be in one big jumbled up mix, I will point you towards jumbled up mixes, and you will see that these are places of great poverty, great inequality, and great violence, in which the stronger rule the weak, and they crush anyone beneath them who dares to dissent. You can look at the Muslims, the Muslim believing world. You can look at a large part of Africa, which is Christian, but quite obviously, is a very good example of why we can't just live among only Christians, why there has to be a national element to it, an element of people and ethnicity. And you can look at South America, and you can look at large parts of Southeast Asia for examples of why you cannot just live among everyone. So to bring it back to a concise answer, essentially, the real Christian belief on this, as comes from the Bible and as comes from early church teachings, is that people should live in nations that are segregated on the basis of ethnicity and religion, with a very small amount of intermixing. In fact, there's a good writing on this by Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas, who was a Catholic saint, a very, very well-read and wise person, speaks on this from the Christian point of view and lays down very strict rules for immigration, which if you read now, they read like incredibly far-right rules. I can tell you them after if you want. But yeah, original Christians believe you should live in nations. It is only modern Christianity which is irreversibly tainted. Certain churches are irreversibly tainted. I think Christianity as a whole can be saved. Is massively tainted, let's say, by liberalism and globalism, which have perverted the church's teachings to be you can live amongst anyone. And practical observation of the modern world tells you that that is not how that works. So Christian nationalists, true Christian nationalists, should be in favor of nation states that are ethnically and religiously homogenous. And anyone who says they are a Christian nationalist who advocates for mass immigration, for example, is not a Christian. I'm not a nationalist.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think the biblical interpretations of Christianity, obviously there is like the different denominations that we have nowadays. But just like in terms of like the language, I mean, you mentioned the word like neighbor, and obviously love thy neighbor is one of the most like common like Christian like jargons that we get nowadays. And I know that in like a sort of like a left-wing ideology, they would see everyone as their neighbor. But I know that the sort of like old English etymology of the word neighbor is it means like near dweller, like neigh being near, and then bore I assume is like you probably like bore to a certain place, like a dweller. And obviously the meaning of dwell is like you're sort of like situated in an area for a certain amount of time. And you know, you can sort of have this sort of like idealistic way of thinking, oh, everyone's my neighbor, we all live on the same planet, like it's fair enough. But yeah, it is when you like compare it to like other terminology used in the Bible. Like if you think of in the sort of I don't know what book it is specifically. It could be Deuteronomy or Leviticus. I think it is Leviticus, where they use the word terminology sojourner. And in sort of like the New International Version translations, sojourner gets changed to like stranger, like just like foreigner, like sort of just anyone that's indifferent to you. Whereas the word sojourner back in obviously the biblical times was more to do with people traveling long distances, but they weren't really settling there for a certain amount of time. There'd be like people passing through for pilgrimages or for trade, stuff like that, staying in like inns and stuff like that. And the sort of I don't know the biblical verse like off the top of my head, but I know in Leviticus or Deuteronomy when they use the word sojourner, it's they tell you, oh, you know, you need to respect like, you know, the people that you're accommodating, that you're sort of like being hospitable towards, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So yeah, there's definitely an interesting relationship on how words get interpreted, because I know on my YouTube channel there's actually a clip where I was interviewing a stand up to racism lady. She was a Christian lady, and she spoke about you know, these refugees that are coming into the country. They're my neighbour, and therefore I've got to accommodate for them. But yeah, this sort of like bastardization of Christianity in the West that we see nowadays, we see a lot of people like Tommy Robinson, for example, that's starting to come out saying like he did that like Christian march, like sort of like celebration a few months ago, and he got people out on the street as like a sort of like a Christmas celebration. But the way he sort of like promotes like sort of like neoliberalism and sort of like these newer Western ideologies and doctrines that we see nowadays, like, you know, that sort of like crowd is still sort of, you know, representative of like, you know, LGBT and like, you know, we accept if you are, as long as you're gay and you don't like promote it on everyone, it's okay. And you know, they've got the traditional elements to them, but they're not quite Christian in the sense of they're still civic nationalists, and they still see the sort of like the bastardization of Christianity, and they do sort of use it as sort of like I don't know what the correct terminology would be, but they do see it as sort of like a front. Maybe a lot of like lefties might say, "Oh, like they're ruining Christianity," and they're like, because I know like a lot of bishops, perhaps in, I think it was I don't know if the bishops at Canterbury like called Tommy Robinson out for not being representative of Christianity or whatnot. But I'd actually say that neither at the moment are representative of what Christianity truly is.
They won't call
in the
them out.
Western
Yeah,
world.
Church of
Do you
England
know
won't
what I
call
mean?
anyone out for not being a real Christian because
Exactly. So
it would too starkly reveal the fact that they aren't true Christians, really.
exactly, yeah. So it's a double-ended sword. Like you know, the Christianity in the West nowadays isn't compatible with what the West used to be, and or have I got that the wrong way around? Now the West
No. I
isn't.
mean, it's mutual,
Yes,
isn't it?
they're just
I
not
wouldn't.
compatible anymore, are they? Like Christianity and Western values, they're completely different. And I keep seeing people use it in the same sort of like sentence, like, "Oh, we need to protect Western Christian values." It's like, which values, you know?
Yeah, what are you talking about, really? Because, yeah, as you were saying, bastardization, we cannot interpret the world without language, and the language that we use to interpret the world is incredibly important. You know, that can change the lens for which we see everything, which can completely change what we see and how we see it, basically. Let's give you an example. Yeah, your neighbor is a great point. Love thy neighbor being the great commandment has been bastardized to become, yeah, as we were saying, to love strangers unequivocally. And yeah, you said sojourner. That sort of stuff basically is what we've got now, where liberalism will slowly but surely undermine and poison the well. And yeah, you end up with stuff like the Church of England. Yeah. I can't really add anything more to what you said, but I just want to sound off that I completely agree. You know, it's if the church fathers of the Nicene Council could see what we do and say and believe today, they'd be fucking shocked. They'd be turned over in their graves. St. Nicholas would have a lot more people to punch. That's for sure.
Yeah, it's definitely
We'd be
an
swinging.
interesting thing. Yeah. But yeah, I'm trying to think of more questions to talk about.
I was going to say, I found what I said about Thomas Aquinas's rules for immigration.
Oh
What
yeah,
he
yeah,
wrote
yeah.
in his
Let's
Summa
let's let's
Theologica.
let's talk about that because was he Thomas Aquinas? Was he like a 12th century monk in Italy, something like that,
I think he was 1200s. Yeah, let me have a quick
something
look.
like that.
Thomas
Yeah,
Aquinas. Yes, 1274 is when he died. Yes, he's 13th century, and he was
13th
Italian.
century. Yeah,
Yes, but no, he's a very intelligent figure. And if you go back and read the kind of things he wrote back then, they are incredibly salient nowadays. He wrote of immigrants slash foreigners in three categories. He said the first were the foreigners who passed through their lands as travelers, so sojourners. One second. Apologies. The second were those who came to dwell in their lands as newcomers, so, people who don't really want citizenship. And the third case involves foreigners who wish to be admitted entirely to their fellowship and mode of worship. They were not at once admitted to citizenship, as it was law with some nations that no one was deemed a citizen except after 2 or 3 generations. He speaks that the reason for this was that if foreigners were allowed to meddle with the affairs of the nation as soon as they had settled in its midst, many dangers might occur, since foreigners not yet having the common good at heart might attempt something hurtful to the people. Basically describing exactly what has happened in modern nations, where the integration of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or millions of people who do not have the common good at heart has led directly to what? The mass rape of our children, votes for abortion or euthanasia, and essentially the destruction of our heritage and our people. Yeah, that's basically all I wanted to quickly throw out there. Very intelligent guy.
yeah. It was interesting. He said about was it like second, third generation?
Yes, he
They
didn't
wouldn't.
believe you should be a citizen until 2 or 3 generations on, essentially. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because I guess in terms of like obviously you've got integration and you've got assimilation. Seems like Thomas Aquinas would have been a sort of advocate for assimilation and that you know is as long as you sort of like intermarry into the tribe and you have
Mm.
children as generations go on, you would eventually become a citizen. And obviously
Mm.
that is sort of like a best case scenario in a way. Like if people do come to this country and they do sort of like intermarry into the tribe and their kids 2-3 generations after, they're still technically part of the tribe in the way. Like we can talk about like some people might say that that's not pure enough or whatever, but to a further extent they're still part of the demographic. But obviously nowadays, because the sort of like the amounts and the capacity that's entering the country is so large, it is turning rather into a replacement
Mm.
rather than
An
being
assimilation.
absorbed into the population. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that's where it
Yeah,
becomes a problem.
immigration should be a sacrifice made on the part of the immigrant. So someone who comes to this country shouldn't be entitled to citizenship just because they've suffered or because they work hard. There should be an ingrained idea that it takes time and generations for your family to be integrated, and you should plant a seed that you do not necessarily get to grow old in the shade of. So you should make a sacrifice on the part of your children and grandchildren to allow them to have better lives, rather than selfishly trying to claim a better life for yourself at the expense of the nation you've just come to. If you want to have a nice life for yourself, stay in your own country and make one. But you should not expect to come to our country, be given everything for nothing, essentially, or for very little, and to immediately confer that onto your children. Aquinas also says that if you want to integrate, true integration is a complete assimilation. It's completely disappearing into the midst of the people. So if you, after 2 or 3 generations, have not intermarried into the local ethnicity or culture, if you've not dropped your religion, you are not eligible to be citizen. So the many millions of people in Britain now who are not Christian, who have come over in the last 50 to 100 years, would not be considered citizens or eligible for citizenship by Aquinas's metric. And I agree with that, I think, because, again, it shows a level of entitlement and a lack of self-sacrifice to come over to our country, but want to keep some things of your own that you brought with you. And the question that has to be begged there is, if where you came from was so bad, then why have you brought anything with you, including your beliefs or religion? And so, yeah, it's concerning.
We've got to the point in the country now where we've got people of like Asian and Black heritage backgrounds who, you know, they've kept within their own communities, you know, as you would expect. You know, people do sort of have a bond and familiarity with people that are like them. That's kind of the base of nationalism. But obviously, when you do it in a sort of like immigration scenario, and we've got to the point now where we've got sort of like third, fourth, fifth generation, if you consider like the Windrush of people from like maybe Pakistan, for example, or Jamaica, who, you know, they haven't, you know, it's like sort of like intermarried into the tribe, and they're sort of like, you know, they're still sort of like homogeneously of a different ethnicity. And the problem that we've got now is that, you know, because they're so gone out of so many generations and they've sort of been westernized in a way. So you could talk about, I think the sort of like problem in the Muslim community that they sort of face is that they're losing a lot of their sons and daughters to this Western liberal ideology, same that we are, and they're not sort of keeping in with their sort of tribe, and there's this sort of that disconnect there. So yeah, it truly is a problem, because if we're going to talk about this idea of like remigration, or how I would more put it as like voluntary repatriation, as I think voluntary repatriation is the only like real sort of logical means that we can really promote this idea against the melting pot of civilizations narrative. That, you know, sorry, I've lost now.
I completely get what you mean. No,
like there's like if they're so westernized into our culture and ways of doing things, and they don't have a stake for their homelands and their traditional identity, then voluntary repatriation, the idea of it, becomes a lot harder to encourage, because, you know, I don't blame a lot of sort of like third, fourth generation migrants that have been westernized and telling them, oh, you need to go home. It does sound very alien to them, you know what I mean? And that's kind of the problem we face in the country. That's kind of what I was getting onto.
Someone said it very rightly. I can't remember who exactly said this to me. Actually, you know what? I'll say this after what I'm going to say. It's a massive concern that there are communities of immigrants who, after 50, 100, 200 years, remain distant from the rest of the population. That is a big issue. And that betrays a lack of integration and assimilation. And that lack of integration and assimilation betrays that they don't actually like the country they live in. They just want to benefit from it. They just want to exploit it. And what I just said then and what you said basically leads me on to what I'm going to say right now. Keep that in mind, and then listen to what I'm going to say right now, which is, it is just as cruel to send them home if they do not have a tie to that land, if they have no conception of it, as it was for their parents and grandparents to bring them here to a country where they have no conception of the land, no ties to it. And so people who advocate for immigration must answer, essentially, the question of, why is mass immigration to somewhere any better than mass emigration from it? And of course, what that will then betray is that for many of these people, mass immigration into the West, by them or by people that they are advocating for, you know, whether it's white Western liberals defending it or it's the immigrants themselves, they will betray that the reason immigration to the West is good but repatriation to the periphery is bad is either one, because there's some sort of white guilt and there has to be a revenge story. There must be some sort of punishment towards white Westerners for what we did, which is insane, especially if it's coming from a white Western liberal. That's suicide. Or two, it is because we have a lot more money and they don't. Them coming to our country gives them a better standard of living. They can exploit the local economy to be comfortable. If we were to send them home, we would be sending them home to shitholes. We would be sending them home to somewhere where it's not comfortable, it's not nice, it's not rich, essentially, and they wouldn't get their welfare. Basically, all of the arguments for mass immigration, or all the proponents of mass immigration who do not also support mass emigration, are in one of those two camps. They think that we need to be punished, or they don't care about the welfare economy and they're happy to continue paying millions out. That's it, basically. All of the arguments of immigration fall flat on that basis, I think, or at least a great majority of the ones that are often fielded now fall flat on those accounts. And so, really, the question of repatriation becomes, do they deserve to be here? No, because they've not integrated and they have no claim to the land in the same way that the people have lived here for hundreds of years do. Two, will it hurt us to remove them? Economically, perhaps, but socially, I do not think it will. And then third of all, coming off of the economic question, is a few extra pounds leaving your pocket, or I suppose a few extra pounds entering your pocket, worth the loss of your culture and heritage and people? No. Fundamentally.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I've never really thought about it in that sort of like dichotomy of, like, if you ask obviously the average liberal, is mass immigration good? They'll say, oh yes, it brings so much diversity and different people and helps us economically and all of that. But then obviously if you ask the question, oh, but is mass repatriation the sort of opposite? Is that not good too? Because isn't it just not the same thing but just in reverse? Like, obviously they're going to say no to that. And then you brought up the 2 points about, obviously, sort of like, is it to do with the sort of past events and past sort of what's the word, campaigns of the British Empire and stuff like that, colonialism, and obviously to do with more like economic side of things. Like, obviously a lot of the countries that people are coming to are, they're quite poor compared to the UK, and that's why they're incentivized to come here. And it got me thinking about the sort of like the early sort of migrations and that. I know there's sort of like a well-known fact that the sort of like Pakistani community in the country actually comes from one specific region of Pakistan. I believe it's Mirpur, which is like the quite north of the country. And I believe that the whole sort of reason they ended up coming to the UK was less about the economic benefits, but I believe that there was like a disaster that happened over there. I just looked it up now quickly. It's the Mangla Dam, and the Mangla Dam was essentially a dam that was built, like, I don't know what the river's called, but essentially the Mirpuri region relied a lot on this dam, and there was a problem with it, and it like flooded the whole valley and displaced like hundreds of thousands of people. And the British government sort of like I guess capitalized on that in a way, and invited a load of Pakistanis to come to the country and work and live and start their own families, businesses here and that. And then obviously the Pakistani grooming gang scandal that's sort of come to surface a lot recently, that's been going on for decades, is sort of interlinked to this specific Pakistani Mirpuri community, which a lot of Muslims would argue that these sort of Pakistanis culturally, these certain like immigrants that came over that were involved in the grooming gangs aren't actually religiously Islamic, and their sort of like cultural elements were more to playing that. But yeah, I'm tangent off a bit. But I wanted to go into the sort of like the colonialism aspects and also talk about sort of like neo-colonialism and the sort of like ties and chains and sort of irreversible, not irreversible, but sort of like chains that we have on our former colonies that are very hard to reverse in a way because British Empire, a lot of people in the nationalist space like pedestalize it a lot. They love the empire. I've got a sort of admiration for it as well, but I've kind of come to the point most recently that it's more. I have more of a neutral view on it because there's this sort of element of like it was very classist. It sort of benefited the upper classes of Britain more than it did the working class, and the fact that sort of the sort of consequences of the empire has led to sort of a lot of destabilization around the world, and eventually this sort of like mass immigration into the West. So yeah, it's very interesting, complex paradox to go over, and I don't know. I'm trying to sort of like conclude it now, but I think if we focused more as nationalists into sort of foreign policy a bit more, or into the sort of the statuses of different countries around the world, especially former colonies, and we sort of promote this idea of like we get it, like obviously repatriation to places like Somalia, for example, that seems like an absolutely worst case scenario. That's a nightmare. Even if it is your homeland, like being with the sort of like situation, political, economical, social situation over there, it doesn't seem very logical, even as a Somalian immigrant over here, to go back. So, I think in terms of like how we would go about voluntary repatriation, there is just loads of complex things to fix, and we do have to sort of consider it more from their point of view why it'd be difficult to sort of enforce. But yeah, I've waffled on a bit, but I was just wondering what you think of that.
Regarding the empire, it's a difficult conversation topic, but a very deep one you could speak for hours about. My personal take on it is that the empire set itself a very high goal in the sense of, well, dominating the world politically and honestly. But in terms of what it made its kind of raison d'etre to be, its national mission, it wanted to spread Christianity and share with the world a lot of English institutions like democracy, well, parliamentary democracy and rule of law, things like that with the world. And we were only human, as anyone is, and we ended up getting embroiled in a lot of corruption. There was a lot of heavy-handed responses to dissent and rejection from the local peoples. And yeah, we ended up doing a lot of very evil things. But, well, I say but so quickly after that, it makes me seem like I minimize them. We did a lot of very evil things, as every empire throughout history has, essentially. That is a integral part of the experience of empire. It's violence, and industrialized violence almost. But the empire was, as you said, fundamentally an empire for aristocrats. It was an empire for the wealthiest in our society. And they benefited while all the cotton workers or all the cotton processors,
our ancestors essentially. Like my dad's side were the farmers in the fields. My mum's side was more Lancashire, like the mills and the factories and stuff. And like I don't know about you, but I don't have any like direct ancestors in my tree that were going abroad to other countries like India or Africa and stuff like that.
Yeah, I don't know my family tree very well, to be fair. But I mean, as you said, you've got the northern like cotton millers and weavers. You've got the dock workers of London. You've got the coal miners, of Wales and the West Country and parts of Scotland as well. You've got all these different working class groups that only marginally benefited from the empire in the sense that their country became very powerful, very prosperous, and a tiny amount of that trickled down in the form of employment opportunities and some welfare to the people. But the majority of the utility of the empire went to the people who oversaw its creation and administrated it, so the highest crust of society. And if you want to deal with it in an even-handed way, the worst parts of the empire were only prosecuted on a small amount of people, because things like reprisal attacks and intentional famines fell hardest on communities that were interpreted as rebellious, which obviously that's not much consolation to the people who died, but they were mostly focused on the people who were seen as dissenting, while the majority of the populations of the colonized countries were receiving much more in benefits than disadvantages, because they were receiving running water, transport links, global products. They were being integrated into a economy, a worldwide economy, which I don't fundamentally agree with as a distributist, but which did look to improve everyone's standard of living by making it more convenient to receive basic necessities. You know, you can hate capitalism as much as you want, and I don't like capitalism, but it has dragged, over the course of the last 200 years, literally billions of people out of poverty. In the same way that you could say socialism did it with the Soviet Union or with Maoist China. It dragged people out of poverty. It cost a lot in life. And I don't think perhaps 70 million lives in China and 60 million in the Soviet Union were worth it. I think it would have been much better had they taken it far more slowly and respected the dignity of life, as we probably should have, perhaps in parts of the empire. But the empire, certainly the British Empire, did a lot of good for its people, its subjects, that now goes unappreciated. I'm not saying it was, on balance, better than it was worse, but it did a lot of things now that go very unappreciated. And all of the hatred of empire falls on the native British, despite all the working class people never having had a hand in it. It was entirely the aristocrats. It was entirely the upper class. And yet that is used, the empire is used as a reason that we should be exterminated in our own country, that we should be replaced, because inherently we are racist, so to speak. So the empire did a lot of good, did a lot of bad, as the majority of political entities throughout history have done. I think we certainly did a lot better than the other European empires of the time. I think we did better than the French. I think we did a bit better than the Spanish. Certainly better than, say, the German Empire or the Italian Empire, the empires that were less focused on nation building and only had a few decades in their respective colonies to extract resources. We spent so long in certain places that we ended up getting bored and building nations, basically. That was what happened. We spent, 50 years in South Africa, and then we decided actually may as well build a functioning state here. In Australia,
Rhodesia lasted for about. Did Rhodesia last for about 60 years, something like that?
Yeah, let me have a look. Rhodesia establishment date. I think it was the 1965. Apparently, is when Rhodesia was formed, but that will be when it was an independent state. The previous colonial territory will have existed for decades. But the point is that yes, in say South Africa, in New Zealand, in Australia, in Canada, we spent a decent amount of time there as settler colonialists. But at some point, we actually set about building functioning states that, had their own representation, had their own cultures, had their own traditions, and were basically different from the homeland at that point. We didn't just endlessly extract. We built when we arrived. And that is something that, can't be said of certain regimes. The Germans didn't build in their respective colonies. The Italians barely built in theirs, if at all. The French tried some very avant-garde ideas about the indivisible union and trying to make everyone French throughout the empire, which ended in disaster, obviously, in Algeria and Vietnam. But yeah, I think on balance, the British Empire was better than it was worse. And obviously, yes, that will be unpopular with the people who think it was bad and unpopular with the people that think it was very good. But I think that is simply the truth of it. And now it shouldn't be a bludgeon with which to beat down native British people to say you should be giving back a insane amount of wealth and prostrating yourself before the third world. Because honestly, we have been through worse in the West. And we didn't complain. We picked ourselves up and we moved on. We had the Black Death in the 12 and 1300s. We had, in Germany at least, the 30 Years' War. And across wider Europe, we had the wars of religion and a variety of upheavals based on nationalism and Protestantism and liberalism. And yet, Europe still pulled ahead. Despite the chaos of the Civil War in England, within 50 years of it, we were pushing for global empire. And yet now you have states in Africa that are incredibly well positioned to put themselves ahead, and yet they sink themselves into corruption. They immediately embroil themselves into corruption and flounder, and they can't get anything done. And perhaps that is because of ongoing neocolonialism, where certain states, I think France is the worst offender in Europe, but America is also very bad. They want to continue maintaining an arm's length control of certain natural resources and certain strategic positions. For example, the Suez. People still want to control the Suez. And that leads them to intervene in those affairs. And I think that's bad and is certainly something we should be condemning in the strongest possible terms. Things like Iran and Ukraine are ultimately arguments between America and Russia. Ukraine is a proxy war. There's no other way to view it. Iran is a proxy conflict between American-backed rebels and the Iranian government. No matter what you think of the morality or immorality of either side, it becomes very hard to advocate for intervention when you're not even fighting for the Iranian people. You are fighting for what the Iranian people have been told is their future or should be their future based off the Americans. The same thing happens in, say, Vietnam, say in Korea, say in, Afghanistan. It's all a matter of what the Americans are trying to sell to build up their power and what the Russians or the Chinese alternatively are also trying to sell to build up a wing of states against America. And so the party, the National Distributist Party and Distributism in general, emphasizing localism, emphasizing fairness, just would not be involved in any of it. And we shouldn't be involved in any of it. That should be a common sense nationalist position, really. Because if it costs even one British life, I don't want to see military support for Ukraine or military support for Iran. It will also cost the lives of Russians and Ukrainians or Iranians for us to lend weapons and lend logistical support. And I don't want to see that either. I want to see the amount of suffering and lost life be minimized. And that's a pretty common Christian position. But again, that's something else that's been lost in the mire of liberalism. There's this idea that you can go crusading any way you want as long as it's in the name of democracy and the international order. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, if we talk about, obviously, we include like America into it as well. You talk about like the proxies with America and Russia. It just feels like a regurgitation of like the Cold War and those days. And if we really think about it in a sort of like Anglosphere, Pax Britannica sense, like there is a sort of element to it where sort of the British and the American sort of I guess influence on the world is so immense that it is very hard to sort of like decolonize in a way. I've been reading a book recently, just like casually. It's called Empire World, and it's written by an Indian guy called Safnam Sangera. And I decided to buy the book because even if there's sort of like left wing, maybe like, and well, I'm not going to say it's like, it's anti-empire, the British people. I don't think it goes to that extent, but I think there is like obviously elements to it where it's sort of like a very anti-imperialist, anti sort of like British like sentiment to it, because obviously it's written by a former like colony member, and he sort of like emphasizes this idea of like this term of like civilizing and going into places and civilizing does come from like a superiority complex, and that sort of like when he went back to like India to sort of like visit and that, he kind of realized that the British colonialism is so like in deep in the culture now in India that it's very hard to reverse, whether that be like the influence on like place names or like the buildings, and even like the sort of like food and nutrition that was sort of like ordered on the Indian people when the British came in, and all these sort of like just little things are still there, and it's still very just hard to reverse into it. And yeah, as you were going into before, like obviously the British, for example, like us, like as the working class people, aren't responsible at all for anything that's happened across the world and that. But I just wanted to ask you, like, obviously in like a nationalistic sense, like we obviously care about our people, and we feel responsible for our people in terms of like looking after them. And even if these people were part of like the highest gentry, the aristocracy, and it was really them that caused all the problems. Obviously none of my direct ancestors ever went anywhere. They always stayed within these isles. If anything, my ancestors have stayed in these isles for thousands of years. In most lines, they're not even like mainland Europe. They are primarily English, well, British as an extension, British and Irish as an extension. That's why I have such an ingrained sort of like focus for my people and nationalism and that. But obviously, I would have had like distant third, fourth, fifth cousins in my tree that would have gone to places like South Africa, would have gone to places like Australia, America, and stuff like that. That is very prevalent in my tree. So, would you say there's still like an element where like even the working class in this country, has to say like, I personally wasn't to blame. My direct ancestors personally wasn't to blame. I haven't inherited any sort of generational wealth from the exploitations of the empire. But I can still say that my fellow people were part of this, and they are somewhat responsible. And is there kind of like a way to sort of like address like the sort of idea that I guess what I'm trying to say is like is there sort of like any form of responsibility, even like really really small, that people like us should be like taking or addressing about the sort of like circumstances of the empire?
What you were saying about colonialism being so deeply engraved in certain states like India that it can never be undone is true. There's always going to be some scars of colonization, but is it always a bad thing? It makes it sound, even calling them scars makes it sound negative. It makes it sound like we've wounded them in some way. For example, Indian democracy is a intrinsic layover of British colonialism. The fact that they have a democracy, even the fact that they have a single unified state, India, Bharat, is because of us. That is something that colonization has left them with, that they can't really ever forget. They could become a non-democratic state, but they can never forget the fact that democracy was given to us by the English. It was given to us by the British. You have to look at the effects of colonization, and rather than try to either, shy away from them as if they never happened, or continually renew a victim card based off of them, you should look at them, and if they are bad, you should try to solve them, and if they are good, then you should keep them to hand. Should the Indians destroy all of their railway systems just because we built them? Of course not. Should they destroy their plumbing systems or their hospitals or their schools? Of course not. We gave it to them, though. It's a scar of colonialism. So, yeah, the idea that you shouldn't ever be influenced by anything or any kind of foreign influence is bad. It's a bit anti-imperialist to the extreme, and I do think that things have to be taken in nuance. As for the responsibility for empire, I think that the best way to treat the empire is to say, the British people, we are happy to want to go forward with the people we colonized and build a brighter future for all of us. But we will never apologize for something we have not done, because it creates a culture of guilt for which we can be exploited. And we shouldn't condemn the empire outright. If we are going to discuss the empire, it should be done in a balanced manner. It should be done in a way that celebrates its victories and condemns its evils. Anyone who is trying to get you, however, to condemn British colonialism on all counts is agenda-driven, essentially. And they want you to condemn your past. Are you really going to tell me that every single part of the empire was bad? Are you going to tell me that the end to widow burnings was bad? That the end to Jagannatha practices was bad? That or I suppose this is more wider European, our civilizational end of slavery and also sacrifice in the New World, in the Americas. Are you going to tell me this was all bad, and that simply because it came from abroad, it shouldn't be taken to heart by the people who it was imposed upon? There was a lot of positive emotion in the empire, a lot of bravery, of heroism, of ingenuity and talent, just as there was a lot of pain and suffering and misery. And so we cannot let this modern black and white approach to politics be applied to our history, because we will just get pushed into the black camp of basically our history is evil and we must condemn it and we must uproot ourselves from our pasts. We should never, ever apologize for what our ancestors did, because our ancestors did them and we didn't. We should be trying to fix ourselves going forward. If our ancestors did something bad, then we should learn from the lessons to do better in the future. If they did good, then we should repeat it.
Exactly, yeah. Like, we see a lot of the sort of people of our own kin that are left wing, and they do become anti-imperialist. They do sort of have this disdain of being English and being British. Like, it's such a taboo. Like, they don't really have an appreciation for their ancestors in a way, and the guilt might even be so extreme that they do promote this melting pot of civilizations narrative, or they're very sort of I guess the word is they're so adverse to their own culture that they they're more likely to mix with somebody that isn't of their own kin as kind of a way of sort of solving that, and I think you probably see that more in America in terms of that. But yeah, it's interesting. I had another thought in my head, but it's just gone now. I've just had a load of carbs or something, so my brain's just dead or something.
The carbs. The fucking carbs, man.
Oh,
traitors one and all.
It's crazy, but I think it's because we're speaking about so many different topics on the podcast that it's kind of going away from me. But I think I've got it back now. So another sort of topic I was thinking about is there's this idea that British identity and British culture, British doesn't have a culture, or British identity, people can't really describe what it is. And I think it's kind of down to this idea of colonization being so ingrained, and sort of the mannerisms, the culture, the lifestyle is kind of synonymous or replicated in different former colonies or people that do immigrate to this country. that they kind of just see British culture as like the default. You know, we can talk about all the different aspects of like British culture. Maybe it's like the pub culture, or it's like the sort of self-deprecating humor, or it's like, you know, the sort of orderliness of like queuing and stuff like that. They're like aspects of British culture and that. But I think there's sort of this like numbness to being British, especially if you're like even a native Brit like myself. If we think just in terms of like the sort of dynamic between the relationship of the British and Irish, well, we see like a lot of like Irish people in Britain now, and I would kind of say that because Ireland was a part of the UK between 1801 and 1922, and still technically is, that they are just as native to this country and these isles as we are, and I do see them as my ethnic brothers. I myself am are part Irish, like 5, 6, 7 generations ago. I did have ancestors that lived in Ireland, but as being mostly English, and you know, having friends that are also kind of this same like British and Irish mix, which is very common in the country, that if we think about sort of how Ireland and Britain is sort of like seen in like pop culture, Ireland is obviously seen as the underdog because they were like obviously had its problems and conflict with Britain for many years. Obviously, we talk about Ulster plantations, Cromwell, the potato famine, stuff like that. And obviously, there's a lot of Irish immigration to Britain and stuff like that. And we have a lot of British celebrities and people we look up to that are of Irish descent and that. And yeah, that's kind of weird because St. George's Day, for example, and we talk about, I in primary school, for example, we used to actually do celebrate St. George's Day quite a lot. We used to like come in with our flags into school. We used to like learn about the story of the George and the Dragon, and we'd eat like Victoria sponges and scones, and it would genuinely, like in my primary school back in the 2010s, like it would genuinely be a day of like Englishness and everyone in the school, you know, because of how ethnically homogenous it was, there was sort of that connection and bonding over this day of St. George and that. But if we think about today and how St. George's Day is treated, it often gets forgotten by the establishment, or it often gets utilized politically by maybe the left to say stuff like, oh, well, St. George, he wasn't even English. And like, actually, this is a day of like how Britain is built on immigration and that, because your own saint isn't even actually native to
Yeah,
these lands and that. And then
good
obviously, if you
point.
think about St. Patrick's Day and how that's glorified so well, like, oh, everyone is so ready to go out on the night out on the lavish bit of Guinnesses and that, and you know, put their leprechaun costumes on, get the green clothes on as they celebrate St. Patrick. And some people don't actually know this, but St. Patrick, he was actually a Briton. He was
Yeah, it came over.
yeah, came. I believe he got captured by Irish raiders, and then he was like a slave over there. He escaped, and then he went back and evangelized and made like Irish like Christian and that. But it's just very interesting that obviously the left kind of have this worldview of like you know, sort of empathizing with the oppressed and going against the oppressor, which, you know, it sounds nice on the surface, but when you were taken to the fact of how St. Patrick's Day is celebrated in England compared to how St. George's Day is celebrated in England, it's just
Night and day.
it really just emphasizes the sort of, yeah, just the bizarreness of it, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, it's just depressing to see that people have been brainwashed into thinking it's like shameful to like certain aspects of our own culture. The thing about Saint George being a Cappadocian Roman soldier, oh, it's hilarious. You get people who say, "Oh, he came from Turkey. You know, he was Turkish. How can you say he's your saint? How can you be racist if you've got a
Yeah,
Turk
the
for
same
a
as like
name?"
your Turkish barber down the road. Like, just...
Exactly. And I find it hilarious because it displays what a shallow knowledge these people have, a shallow like understanding of history these people have. Turks didn't exist until like the thousands because of because of mass migration from the steppe. So first of all, he wouldn't have been Turkish, he would have been Greek. And second of all, the most important thing about St. George is not the color of his skin or his ethnicity, it's what he stands for. It's the fact that he portrays and embodies all the things that we want to see in Englishmen, and he is the stereotypical English knight, the kind of chivalric hero that we looked up to in days gone past, and which came to be a staple of like Arthurian legend as well. It doesn't matter that he's fucking Greek. It's the fact that he is an English hero. He's a hero to the English. And so, yeah, just whenever people say that, that makes me check out of a political conversation. If someone says, St. George, shut the fuck up, please. Holy.
Yeah.
And to go back to what you said about British culture, people who say, what really is British culture? It is such a privilege. And for me, it is a massive source of pride that I live in a country where British culture is literally so pervasive that it is invisible. In the same way that a goldfish in their bowl cannot see the glass because it surrounds them completely, British people cannot see the culture of their ancestors around them because it is literally everywhere. You cannot escape it. It is in everything. It's in architecture. It's in dinner customs. It's in the food we eat. You can literally bring up anything in the country, and there is an aspect of it that came from our ancestors. The business suit is one of the biggest ones that I like to point out to people, because the business suit is fundamentally Western, and it's very much comes from England, and it's just little things like that people tend to overlook because they're on an agenda-driven mission to make British culture seem minuscule and seem juvenile, and it's just disgusting, really. It's just disgusting that these people could, for their own selfish ends, essentially, for their own political ends, tell massive lies about our history and our ancestors. Just fundamentally aren't true. Just at their most fundamental, they are lies.
Yeah, it's interesting, especially the business suit. I mean, what country's politician or any working businessman doesn't have that suit, whether you're Western or Eastern or not? It's very pervasive, like you said. It's almost too pervasive that, like you said, there is sort of this numbness to being English. It's sort of like there's sort of this like boringness, like it's not like in a sense of that. It's not good to be. It's not stimulating to be British. Of course it is, but when you're having sort of like relationships with people internationally, there is sort of that element where they're going to know more about your culture than you're going to know about theirs. I mean, language, for example, is a good indicator of that. That most English people from the English speaking world, most people are monolingual, whereas anyone that interacts with you that comes to this country is inherently going to be bilingual, multilingual, and that's sort of a benefit that our ancestors have sort of cultivated for us in a way. Or our ancestors, our people, have cultivated for us, and obviously the English, in terms of its sort of like arts, was very very like strong on its literature. Like obviously we've got people like Shakespeare, Dickens, Tolkien. All these famous authors and playwrights that really established the sort of like the complexities of English language metaphorically, similes, and yeah, I'm just talking about GCSE English language here now. But yeah, like that was kind of what helped the British Empire prosper as well. Like this sort of like reinvention of language and being able to communicate and with people that weren't like yourself, and were able to establish colonies with these different populations around the world, whilst only being a small minority of the population. Like you've got to think that like all these colonies that got established, like it wasn't like a full invasion takeover. Like the people of those lands were inherently, they did inherently submit to it for it to be able to happen. And I think I kind of see those traits in myself where I'm kind of like a quintessential British guy that still has this interest with international relations, tourism, travel, and sort of like, sharing the British culture with other people in sort of like a hospitality way. But I don't want to be sharing the British culture in the sense that I'm giving my lands away to people that, quite frankly, aren't native to these lands and that. So yeah, like I think there is um, like an interesting sort of like feeling of being like natively British, and I would in my ways I would actually prefer it that the British would kind of like retire in a way and sort of like go dormant, and so I kind of wish that places around the world would sort of decolonize themselves, or more frankly, they would embrace their more traditional indigenous ways of doing things as a way to sort of broaden that polarization that international relations does have on people, and the sort of joy of international relations, whether that be through tourism or business or whatever, to sort of be less British. I kind of have this idea of like, I'd rather like people from foreign lands sort of stop this sort of like assimilation and trying to be like us in a way. I
Well,
think that would make the
yeah,
world more interesting.
I spent a year living in Japan, and it was as different from Britain as you could possibly get, I think, in terms of
Yeah,
how
I
they
think I think like
organize
the East
society.
Asians are
Very
obviously,
different.
yeah, away from the sort of empire influence. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, go on.
And yeah, I didn't feel uncomfortable in their country. I didn't feel like a stranger. I obviously wasn't at home, but a stranger has a negative context that you feel uncomfortable, and I didn't feel uncomfortable abroad in Japan. And so I want other countries to maintain their cultures, their differences, their positive differences, and to exhibit them to the world for people's enjoyment. I'm not against other cultures or peoples existing. I simply want mine to exist as well and to be sovereign in its own country. I think that's what the main gripe with immigration is, and with the replacement of our people and our culture. It's the fact that we are being told that having as many cultures and religions as possible is a good thing, but we're having ours destroyed. So they're taking
Exactly.
a culture out of it, they're taking a religion out of it. Is not all diversity good then? Well, if you admit not all diversity is good, then that's a big question. Well, why isn't diversity good? Is a culture that encourages you to rape children a good culture? Well, obviously not. And at that point, the globalist idea that diversity is our strength collapses in on itself. It collapses in itself because you immediately have to start making quality judgments about the immigrant groups that are coming into our country, and many of them won't meet the standard, frankly. And
Yes.
then what do? Well, you have to start either breaking down their culture and properly integrating them, which in the numbers that we've got now is basically impossible, or repatriating them, or taking away their political power and their economic privilege. It's about seizing back control of the various institutions of the country from them. And that's what it has to become, because I don't want to watch my people be extinguished. I am willing to fight for them. And that fight is actually quite benignly epitomized in things like Restore Britain or other political movements that are calling out immigration. We could do it a lot more violently. If we wanted all foreigners gone and we had no scruples and no morals, well, then you'd see a lot more radical, violent groups trying to do it. But no, the British people are fundamentally, we're a kind people. We are a polite, a moral people who want to see other cultures flourish within their own borders. But we are rapidly becoming a people who are being driven to the edge and cannot tolerate that any longer. We cannot tolerate being abused in our own country.
Exactly. Like, I would say that, like, on the surface level, this idea of like diversity and multiculturalism, like, if you were to frame it as like, oh, do you believe in a diverse multicultural world? Then I'd say yes. Like, not much different to people like Zach Polanski, who are very adamant on declaring this sort of rhetoric and an agenda. Because if you think about it, like if you said like, "Oh, do you believe in a diverse, multicultural country?" I'd tell you no, because obviously this sort of like idea that like we're mixing together in this melting pot, in a way, it doesn't necessarily go out like that. I mean, if you look at London, for example, it's just a case of not necessarily multiculturalism, but multi-enclavism, and the different ethnic groups and respective religions and cultures within London are still like separated into their respective boroughs. I mean, if you think about Southall, for example, that's very majority Indian, and if you think of like Tower Hamlets, that's very majority Bangladeshi. So yeah, there is definitely that sort of like element as well, where the British, we are a very tolerant people. We do respect all cultures around the world. I'd say my sort of idea is more ethno pluralist, where every respected nation, country in the world, however they want to identify themselves, should be sovereign and should be be able to determine stuff for themselves and that. So yeah.
Yeah. Self-determination should exist for everyone, including the British people, the native British. And I'm happy to, if that means that we stop, stealing, exploiting resources from around the globe, and we take a small hit because we now have to produce things ourselves, pay our workers a decent wage to make cars and all that, within our own borders, I'll take that, because really that's what we should have been doing from the start. Taking a principled stand and saying, yeah, it's wrong for us to exploit third world labor, and it's actually better for the average working class Brit for everything to be made within our own country, because the jobs it will create and the increase in the wages will be phenomenal. It only hurts billionaires and millionaires and the people who pull the levers of power to use indigenous labor, native British labor, to make all these things. That is the only group that it's negatively affected by that. So that's just about breaking the international finance market, though. That's just something that has to be done. And that is why I'm distributist and not capitalist, because I do think that we have a lot of ground to cover in achieving an actual moral economy. Not just the best economy, but an economy that properly suits all of its people as much as it can and doesn't cheap out effectively. It doesn't sell itself out.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, absolutely spot on. I do agree with that. But yeah, we've spoken for about an hour and a half now. My throat, I've never been used to doing so much talking. Your throat goes very funny. But yeah, it's been a really good conversation. Obviously this is my first ever podcast, so what's the sort of end credits? It's I'll leave Fraser's social links in the description. But Fraser, if you want to tell people where they can find you, yeah, that'd be good.
Yeah, sure. I can be found personally on Twitter at Gloucester Patriot, which will be in the description below. You can find the party on Twitter as well at NatDis Party, National Distributist Party. We also have a large Instagram presence, which again, national.distributist.party. And we will also see you in public, hopefully. If you are interested in the party, you're more than welcome to attend any of the meetings that we are holding in the next month. There are 4 regional meetings going on: Northeast, Southeast, Northwest, and Southwest. And we're looking at holding a national conference in May. You're welcome to attend any of those meetings, any of our activism, and contact me personally if you want. And that can be done through any of the before mentioned Twitter or Instagram handles. Yeah, I didn't really feel like I spoke too much about the party, but yeah, if anyone has any questions, then I'm more than happy to answer them. Basically, to give a closing statement as if I was a lawyer, this country, it needs a lot more than it has. It deserves a lot more than it has. The people don't deserve to continue existing under the yoke of capitalism or globalism. We deserve to own for ourselves our houses, the tools which we use to work. If you don't work in a trade job, then you deserve to own a part of the company that you are building. this is basic stuff, but it's all things that you have been lied to and told that you don't deserve for whatever reason, because you don't generate enough value, because you're just one among millions, whatever. Reject that system, reject the global system that has yoked you to it for centuries, and vote Distributist. Thank you.
Sounds very good. Thank you for coming on the podcast. Really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me, mate.
Sounds.